The architecture of silence. What John Deacon finally said when the Queen logic collapsed. Between Freddie's operatic fire and Brian's cosmic roar, there was a calculated, quiet void. For 15 years, John Deacon didn't just play the bass. He played the referee, the accountant, and the anchor for three of the loudest egos in rock history. He was the man who kept his mouth shut while his bass lines like "Another One Bites the Dust" conquered the world. But even the most disciplined anchor eventually cuts the rope. When the music faded and the arguments turned to echoes, what did John Deacon finally say to a world that had forgotten he was even listening? London, 1986. A journalist sits across from Queen's bass player in a hotel suite, tape recorder running. For the first time in 15 years, John is doing an interview alone. No Freddie Mercury dominating the conversation. No Roger Taylor interrupting with strong opinions. No Brian May carefully explaining every detail. Just John, finally able to finish a sentence. What he says in the next hour will reveal more about Queen than any concert footage or music video ever could, because the quiet one is about to talk. And when the person who's been silent for 15 years finally speaks, you should probably listen. This is what he said. The journalist asks the obvious first question. How does it feel after 15 years with Queen? John's answer is honest. It varies greatly. Sometimes it's very enjoyable. Sometimes it's rewarding, and sometimes it's very frustrating and annoying. Not the polished answer you'd expect from a member of one of the world's biggest rock bands. No PR spin about how grateful he is or how amazing the journey has been. Just the truth. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's awful, and somehow they're still together. So what are relationships within the band like? The journalist asks. John doesn't hesitate. Sticky at times. There it is, the reality behind the spectacle. Queen argues, constantly, about everything. We do argue a lot, John continues, which is quite a strain sometimes. We argue about everything, and we argue about nothing sometimes, which I find frustrating. He gives an example. Just the other day, they finished filming a music video. The work was done. Everyone had performed their parts. The crew was packing up equipment. A normal end to a normal day. Then Freddie and Roger started shouting at each other. John watched from the side, trying to figure out what triggered it this time. Eventually, he understood. They were arguing about the box set of albums being released at Christmas. Something about packaging or track listing. Some detail that would be forgotten the moment the product hit stores. John couldn't understand why this mattered enough to shout about. Something to me didn't seem very important, he says, and you can hear the exhaustion in his voice. This is John Deacon's life. Watching people he respects and cares about waste energy fighting over things that don't matter. Unable to make them see how pointless it is. Unable to get them to just stop and breathe and remember they're supposed to be friends. The journalist asks if it's all three of them ganging up on Freddie, or if there are alliances within the band. John shakes his head. The arguments can be between anyone at any time, depending on what's going on. No permanent teams. No predictable battle lines. Just four people who've been together long enough to know exactly which buttons to push and how hard to push them. It is difficult staying together for this amount of time, John admits. 15 years is a long time. The journalist asks if they see each other when they're not working. Occasionally, yes, John says. He sees Roger most often. They ski together, spend time outside of band business. It's easier with Roger somehow. Less complicated. But the others, less frequent. And maybe that's healthier. Maybe you need distance from people you work with so intensely. Here's what the journalist doesn't know yet. John Deacon has spent 15 years not being able to finish a sentence in group interviews. Whenever Queen sits down for press, the same pattern plays out. A journalist asks a question. Before John can even decide if he has something to say, Freddie launches into an answer complete with dramatic gestures. Roger interrupts to correct something or add his perspective. Brian starts a careful, diplomatic response that takes 3 minutes to complete, and John sits there, waiting for an opening that never comes. I could never get a word in edgeways, John explains when the journalist asks why he keeps such a low profile. So I used to sort of keep quiet and just listen. The journalist seems surprised. This is John Deacon, member of Queen, one of the biggest bands in the world. Shouldn't he fight to be heard? But John sees it differently. I was quite happy not to do interviews, he says simply. Why fight? Why add his voice to a room already too loud? It's easier to observe, to listen, to let the others perform while he stays quiet. But there's a cost to that silence, a frustration that builds when you keep thoughts locked inside because there's no space to say them out loud. Perhaps I'm too restrained, John admits. A lot of my thoughts I keep back and don't voice them that often, which is probably why I end up getting a bit frustrated sometimes. He's learned to survive by being stubborn. When he does speak up, he states his opinion once, clearly, then refuses to engage in the endless back and forth that Freddie and Roger thrive on. I'm a bit more stubborn, John explains. This is my point of view, and that's it, and I don't want to go into a big, lengthy discussion. The journalist asks directly, do you sulk? John considers this for a moment, then, probably, yes. It's the most honest answer possible. Yes, he sulks. Yes, he withdraws. Yes, he gets frustrated and shuts down rather than fighting battles he knows he can't win. That's what I think, and I don't want to discuss it anymore, he says. And you can hear years of practiced detachment in those words. This is how John Deacon survives Queen, by choosing silence, by picking his battles, by knowing when to speak and when shutting up is the only sane response. The journalist shifts topics to Under Pressure, the collaboration with David Bowie recorded in Switzerland a few years earlier. John's face changes slightly. This is clearly a story worth telling. That was problematic as well, he says. Here's what happened. Bowie came to the studio in Montreux where Queen was working. They played him some material they were developing. Then everyone went upstairs and started jamming. The creative energy was good. Someone suggested writing a song together. What resulted was Under Pressure, credited to Queen and David Bowie, though John notes it was mainly Freddie and Roger and David who wrote most of it. But the writing process wasn't smooth. Because David Bowie, despite being a guest in Queen's studio, had very specific ideas about how things should be done. And he wasn't shy about sharing those ideas, loudly, repeatedly. He was quite a little Hitler in a way when he got going, John says, and there's amusement in his voice now. The journalist laughs, surprised by the description. Really? Well, he was pushing us and being dominant, John confirms. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Because Bowie's dominant approach created completely different reactions in different band members. John didn't mind at all. I didn't mind that, he says clearly. But Brian may? Brian took offense. Because Brian doesn't like being told what to do, especially in his own recording studio. The journalist wants details. Was Bowie actually telling them how to play their instruments? Oh yeah, John confirms. John, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Think about that scene for a moment. David Bowie, one of rock's greatest artists, telling John Deacon, bass player for Queen, that he's playing his own bass incorrectly. The potential for massive ego collision is obvious, but John just adjusted his playing and moved on. I didn't mind, he repeats. This tells you everything about John Deacon's personality. He doesn't need to be right. He doesn't need to defend his choices. If someone has a better idea, fine. If they're wrong but insistent, also fine. It's not worth the fight. Brian couldn't do that. Brian needed to be respected, consulted, treated as an equal creative voice. Bowie's approach violated that need, and Brian responded with offense. But John played what Bowie wanted and forgot about it 10 minutes later. The conversation moves to Queen's career trajectory. 15 years is long enough to experience massive success and painful failure. Long enough to be beloved and then dismissed as dinosaurs. Long enough to learn that critics can be cruel and public opinion shifts like wind. We've had our ups and downs over the years, John says carefully. It hasn't been a smooth course. He brings up Hot Space, the 1982 album that took Queen in a more dance and funk-influenced direction. The album was destroyed by critics and disappointed commercially compared to Queen's previous success. Very badly received, John says, and you can still hear the wound in his voice. Actually, it was quite a blow to our inner confidence as a group. This matters, because the public perception of Queen is usually about invincibility, about stadium-filling confidence and theatrical excess. But John is revealing something more vulnerable, that bad reviews hurt deeply. That commercial failure damages the band's collective belief in themselves. It took us quite a while to get back and sort ourselves out to do the works, John continues. The recovery wasn't quick. It required time and serious effort to rebuild what one poorly received album had shattered. We're quite sensitive to outside comments and things, he admits. The journalist asks about the punk rock explosion in 1977, when bands like Queen were dismissed as outdated dinosaurs by the new wave of stripped-down, aggressive music. Did that hurt? Did it force Queen to change their approach? John acknowledges they got plenty of criticism during that period, but Queen was touring internationally by then, beyond England where punk's influence was strongest. At least we were able to keep working and not be totally affected by what was happening solely in England, he explains. Still, the music reached them. John admits his favorite album from that entire era was actually the Sex Pistols record. Very energetic, he says with genuine appreciation. But did punk make Queen fundamentally change who they were? I don't think it made us think we should change totally, John says. Everything affects you a little bit subtly, I'm sure, with all the different music that's coming out. But I don't think it made us think we were going wrong. The journalist asks what John does when Queen isn't working. It's a simple question that opens up a complicated problem. Some of the time, I actually got very bored this last year or so, John admits. Here's the issue. For the first 10 years of Queen's career, they worked nonstop. Recording, touring, promoting, recording again. Constant motion, constant purpose. No time to wonder what you'd do if the music stopped. Then the pace slowed down. Freddie did a solo album that consumed a lot of time. Other members pursued individual projects, and John, who'd built his entire adult life around being busy with Queen, suddenly found himself with nothing to do. I didn't really know what to do outside it, he says, so I spent a lot of time being bored and fed up, which wasn't very good for me. The journalist asks about hobbies or business interests. Anything to fill the time? Not particularly, no, John admits. He reads a lot, enjoys it, but reading isn't enough when you're used to the intensity of creating and performing music at the highest level. I think eventually now I'm going to have to start doing something musically as well to fill in the spare time, John says, because the worst thing is having nothing to do. You get bored and it's horrible. The contrast is stark. For a decade, Queen worked solidly, nonstop. Recording, touring, John lists. Then the pace changed, and adjusting to that change proved harder than the work itself. When you slow down, it's hard to get used to it, he says simply. This is what nobody tells you about being in a successful band. The downtime is harder than the work. When the structure disappears, you're left with yourself and the question of who you are when you're not making music. And John Deacon, sitting in this hotel room, hasn't figured that out yet. The conversation shifts to Queen's music videos. The journalist brings up I Want to Break Free, where all 4 band members dressed in drag, parodying a British soap opera. John's immediate response, we were a bit nervous actually, because dressing 4 rock stars in women's clothing and wigs wasn't just funny costumes and playing characters. It was Queen doing something potentially career-damaging for the sake of humor and subverting their own image. But once they got into costume, something interesting happened. When you've got an outfit on, you can actually act the character, and it's not being yourself, John explains, as silly as you like. The drag costumes created freedom. John could be completely ridiculous without it reflecting on John Deacon the person. It was the character being silly, not him. Freddie loved it, actually, John says, and you can hear the smile in his voice. The video worked. Most people enjoyed it. It made them smile. Roger had been particularly keen on showing that Queen had a sense of humor, that they weren't taking themselves too seriously despite their reputation for theatrical excess. The only negative reaction came from America. They didn't like it that much, John says. American audiences had a different image of Queen as a heavy rock band, and the drag didn't fit that perception. But John doesn't seem bothered. The video accomplished what they wanted. It showed Queen could laugh at themselves. The journalist asks about videos generally. How does someone from a pre-video generation of bands feel about this new industry requirement? John's thoughtful about this. Videos are necessary now, he acknowledges, but they're tricky. Sometimes you hear a song without seeing the video and you have your own imagery in your mind of what it might be like, he explains. Sometimes seeing a video is disappointing. It detracts from the song. But some videos enhance the music. John specifically mentions David Lee Roth's videos as examples that add value through entertainment and humor. Very funny, he says with appreciation. It's a balanced perspective from someone who's been forced to adapt to an industry change he didn't ask for, but has learned to navigate professionally. The journalist brings up Live Aid, the massive charity concert in July 1985, where Queen's 20-minute performance became the day's most talked-about set. Did Queen go in wanting to steal the show? Not really, John says, though he admits there's always a competitive element when you're performing alongside other major acts. But actually committing to do Live Aid took Queen a surprisingly long time. We were thinking about the billing and all that sort of thing, John explains. They wanted to know who else would perform, whether the logistics would actually work with dozens of artists doing short sets. The practical concern is very John Deacon. Let other people make emotional, impulsive decisions. He'll wait and see if the plan makes sense first. Once they committed, though, Queen approached Live Aid strategically. We actually spent like 3 or 4 days rehearsing for it, John reveals. They figured out how to compress the essence of a Queen show into 20 minutes. Let's get a little bit of Bohemian Rhapsody in, a little bit of Radio Gaga, John describes the planning process. The result was essentially a mini-show, carefully constructed for maximum impact. It ended up as a very mini-show in a way, and obviously it worked because it really did pick it up at that point in the afternoon, John says. When the journalist asks how it felt to steal the show, John's response is characteristically measured. Obviously, it was pleasing. But then he reveals something more significant. It was a shot of confidence for us. Think about the context. This is only 3 years after Hot Space damaged Queen's collective belief in themselves. Live Aid wasn't just a successful performance. It was proof that Queen still mattered, that they could still command an audience, that all the criticism and changing trends hadn't diminished what they could do when they got on stage. I was just glad to be involved in the whole thing, John adds, and the sincerity is clear. The interview is winding down. The journalist has gotten far more than the typical Queen sound bites. John Deacon, freed from competing with 3 louder personalities, has revealed the reality behind the spectacle. Queen argues constantly about everything and nothing. They're sensitive to criticism despite their success. They struggle with identity and purpose during downtime. They took career risks like drag videos and survived America's confusion. They carefully strategized their biggest triumph at Live Aid while making it look spontaneous. And John Deacon has spent 15 years watching it all from the quiet corner, keeping most of his thoughts locked inside, sulking when frustrated, stating his opinion once and then refusing to engage in endless arguments that go nowhere. But here's the final revelation, the one that explains why this interview is happening at all. When the journalist asks why John is finally doing a solo interview after 15 years of avoiding them, John's answer is simple and profound. "It's my turn this time," he says. Then adds, "In fact, I volunteered. Not forced, not obligated, not pressured by management or label demands. Volunteered. Because even the quiet one eventually needs to be heard. Even the man who spent 15 years unable to get a word in edgewise has things worth saying. Even the bass player who doesn't mind being told he's doing it wrong has strong opinions about what's right." John Deacon chose silence for 15 years, not because he had nothing to say, but because saying it seemed impossible when the room was always too loud. He learned to survive by observing, by listening, by picking his battles and saving his energy for the arguments that actually mattered. He watched Freddie and Roger fight about box sets, watched Brian take offense at David Bowie's directions, watched Queen get destroyed by critics and then triumph at Live Aid, watched everything while saying almost nothing. But today, in this hotel room, John Deacon talked. And what he revealed is that Queen isn't just the theatrical performances and elaborate videos and stadium shows that millions of people see.